Top 12 Reasons for Addiction. Addiction is often the result of a complex interplay of numerous factors, including a person's genetics and environmental influences. Two people may be addicted to the same drug, yet have vastly different reasons for using. Most professionals agree that addiction isn't solely attributed to one solitary cause. Rather, addiction is a complex disease that forms as a culmination of many factors. The causes of an addiction are many and include genetic tendency, peer pressure, stress, experimentation, addictive personality, environment. Some of these are considered to be more controversial than others. Number 1. Genetic tendency. There is evidence to suggest that some people are more susceptible to developing an addiction, although this is not conclusive. This doesn't mean that the addiction is passed down in their family, rather their biological makeup is hardwired in such a way that makes them more prone to dependency. Heredity is the process of parents passing on traits to their children at birth. Children receive 46 chromosomes containing thousands of genes from their parents. Genes determine the specific traits that a child will have, such as physical traits, determine a person's outer appearance, such as eye and hair color. Behavioral traits, influence the way a person acts, such as how shy or outgoing a person is. Predisposition to medical conditions, can also be impacted by traits and may increase a person's risk of getting a disease, such as cancer. Addiction is considered moderately to highly heritable, meaning that genetics play a significant role in addiction. In other words, people who have relatives with addiction problems have an increased risk of developing an addiction themselves. The influence of genetics on addiction varies from drug to drug. Below is the breakdown of heritability of dependence on or abuse of specific drugs. Cocaine, 0.72 heritability or 72%. Opiates, 0.70 heritability or 70%. Alcohol, 0.55 heritability or 55%. Sedatives, 0.50 heritability or 50%. Marijuana or cannabis, 0.41 heritability or 41%. Hallucinogens, 0.39 heritability of 39%. Specific genes that have been linked to addiction include the A1 allele of the dopamine receptor gene DRD2 is associated with alcohol and cocaine addiction. The lack of HTR1B gene is associated with cocaine and alcohol self-administration in mice. Lower levels of neuropeptide Y in mice is related to consuming larger amounts of alcohol. A defective PER2 gene in mice is related to greater alcohol use. Having 2 copies of the ALDH2 gene variation is linked to a lower likelihood of alcohol addiction. You may have inherited a gene which stimulates a craving for an illicit substance or means that you are drawn towards certain substances. You need to satisfy cravings or a desire, for example nicotine addiction due to cigarette smoking is said to be dominant in you. If you grow up in a house where addiction is condoned or even encouraged, then you are at risk of doing the same. UK Drug Rehab, www.ukrehab.com, state that your genes plus these other factors can contribute as much as 60% of the risk of developing an addiction. It is as well to be aware that there may be a risk, but it is also important to realize that it may never happen. Having a genetic tendency towards addiction doesn't mean that you will develop into an addict, just that you may do so. Number 2. Peer pressure. This is something which tends to affect young people rather than adults. Young people place a high value on what their friends think and do and are keen to fit in with their peer group. If that group takes drugs, or smokes cigarettes or enjoys drinking, then the pressure is there to do the same. The desire for pleasure or an instant buzz overrides other considerations such as the likelihood of harm to the user or the potential overspill into other areas of their lives. This also includes the consequences of their actions upon others, for example, their parents, other members of their family or friends. We have all been young, and part of growing up is engaging in risky or forbidden activities. Sometimes it is a case that the more risky or illegal an activity, the greater the attraction. There is also the fact that smoking, drinking alcohol or taking drugs are seen as acts of rebellion. Young people know that these potentially harmful substances are bad for them, which make them even more attractive. Plus, the thought of doing something that is both risky and frowned upon by adults only adds to the excitement. It is tempting to indulge in this behavior when part of a group, as many young people don't believe that it will lead to an addiction or even damage their health in the long run. Number 3. Stress. Stress is blamed for many of the problems in our society. We live our lives at an increasingly frenetic pace, working longer hours to provide a decent standard of living without finding time to relax. Going for a few drinks after work is one way of relaxing, as is taking drugs such as cocaine at parties. This may initially seem like a good way of coping with stress, but once it becomes a regular habit, then it is in danger of leading to addiction. Alcohol, cigarettes, caffeine, and drugs are used as forms of stress relief, but they only compound the problem. There are the effects of stress combined with the effects of the substance, which can easily spiral out of control. Cigarettes and alcohol are the most accessible forms of drugs and usually the most affordable. Alcohol is also a socially acceptable drug, and due to this is not considered to be a problem. So going for a few drinks after work with your colleagues is considered to be a normal part of the working day. There is also the issue of money. If your job is well remunerated, then this will enable you to spend money on these substances as and when you like. What happens then is that you spend more and more money in order to fuel your addiction, which leads to serious financial problems, which then causes more stress, which results in an increase in your addiction, and so on. Number 4. Experimentation. This is a form of behavior that is more commonly seen in teenagers and young people, often seen as part of growing up or being part of the gang. Experimentation with drinking, drugs, or smoking can result in addiction. If you are part of a group of friends who are trying these substances, then you are more than likely to do the same. But sometimes it only takes one puff of a cigarette or that first line of cocaine and you are hooked. The sad fact is that this might never happen with a different group of friends and in different circumstances. Number 5. Addictive personality. It has been suggested that there are people with certain personality traits which predispose them towards addiction. These people are said to have an addictive personality, which means that they are more likely to turn to drugs, cigarettes, or alcohol than other groups of people. Is this true? It is not conclusive, but there is evidence to suggest that this is the case. Number 6. Environment. A person's environment, or the people, places, and things that he or she is exposed to can also influence whether or not an addiction develops. Aspects of a person's environment that may play a role in causing addiction include: if you were brought up in a household in which your parents both smoke and drank heavily, then there is a greater chance of you doing the same, but it is not automatic that you will do so. Being exposed to addictive substances when young may explain a tendency to dependency in adulthood, although there are people who avoid doing so. Another related factor is a chaotic childhood or abuse. If you suffered abuse in your childhood, were neglected, or conversely, treated very harshly, then that is a strong trigger for addiction. In this situation, alcohol or drugs provide a means of dealing with feelings of self-hate or alienation. Number 7. Trauma. Childhood experiences, both positive and negative, can have a significant impact on a person's physical and emotional health. Adverse childhood experiences can be stressful, traumatic events that may lead to physical and emotional difficulties. Examples of adverse childhood experiences include physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical or emotional neglect, witnessing violence, having a family member with a mental illness, having an incarcerated family member, having a family member who is addicted to drugs or alcohol, parental separation or divorce. Number 8. Mental health. There is a strong link between a person's mental health and addiction. People who suffer from an anxiety or mood disorder, such as depression or bipolar disorder, are twice as likely to also have a substance use disorder. Those with conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder also have an increased risk of alcohol or drug addiction. A person is said to have a co-occurring disorder or dual diagnosis when both a mental health disorder and addiction are present. In 2015, 8.1 million Americans had a co-occurring disorder. Both addiction and mental health disorders are impacted by several factors, including genetics, history of trauma, and the environment. In some cases, people may use drugs and alcohol as a way to self-medicate or cope with mental health issues. Number 9. Sensitivity. Some people are more sensitive to a particular substance than others, for example, caffeine. It may be the case that you can drink several espressos in a day and not be affected in the slightest, whereas another person will be climbing the walls after just one cup. We are all different, and what affects one person may not affect someone else at all. Number 10. Type of substance. Some drugs are much more addictive than others. For example, cocaine, heroin, and amphetamines can cause addiction after just one use. Other drugs require several sessions before they result in an addiction. Number 11. Availability of drugs. If a drug is easier to get hold of than others, then it will show higher rates of addiction than something which is difficult to obtain. A good example of this is prescription drugs, which are widely available and whose use has been linked to increased dependency rates. Number 12. Ethnicity. Ethnicity plays a part in that there are certain racial groups who show a lower tolerance to drugs than others. There are biological factors in regard to addiction, but cultural issues are also a factor here. If a certain drug is seen as an acceptable part of a society, then there is a greater risk of addiction than in societies which have banned this substance.